Hello, my name is Morgan Farley, Sitnajini Nishlin, Bitani Bashishchin, Honegani Dashache Adok Uzeflane Dashanele. I'm a health technician here at Northern Navajo Medical Center with the Domestic Violence Prevention Program. In this presentation, we will be covering sex trafficking in Indian country. So first, to define human trafficking. Human trafficking is a broad term to define the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. So there are different types of human trafficking, and sex trafficking falls underneath human trafficking. So sex trafficking is the sexual exploitation of women, men, and children. Labor trafficking is the sale of individuals for uncompensated work. And we also have organ trafficking, which is the sale of individuals for organ harvesting. So specifically today, we will just be covering sex trafficking. So the legal definition for sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transporting, provision, or obtaining a person for the purpose of commercial sex acts, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So there's a few different words in there that you would need to pay some special attention to. The first one is coercion. So coercion are threats of serious harm or physical restraint, anything intended to cause a person to believe that the failure to perform an act will result in serious harm. There's also force. It could be physical assault, physical confinement and isolation, using rape and other forms of sexual violence and or domestic violence. Next, we have fraud, which is false or deceptive offers of employment, marriage, or a better life, lying about work conditions, false promises, or also withholding wages. So these are the different types of tactics that traffickers will use in order to obtain a victim. So legally, looking at the definition, it is sex trafficking if it does include either force, fraud, or coercion. For child sex trafficking, the definition is when a child who is under 18 years of age is induced to perform a commercial sex act regardless of being coerced. So this is a little bit different. It does not need to have the presence of force, fraud, or coercion in order to be considered child sex trafficking, as long as there is a child victim who is 18 years or younger and is being induced to perform any type of commercial sex act. So child sex trafficking is very prevalent here in the United States. About 1 in 6 reported runaway youth were most likely victims of sex trafficking. And child sex trafficking has been reported in all 50 U.S. states. We do know that child sex trafficking does have devastating consequences because the victims are so young. It can result in long-lasting physical and psychological trauma, as well as disease such as HIV and AIDS. It can also lead to drug addiction, unwanted pregnancy, malnutrition, as well as death of the victim. So an important distinction to make when talking about sex trafficking is the difference between sex work and sex trafficking. So oftentimes sex workers, or they are also called prostitutes, are commonly mistaken for being victims of sex trafficking. And while some people who are involved in prostitution are victims of sex trafficking, there are also people who choose to do sex work as their job. So the differences between these two types of situations: for sex work, it is voluntary. The individual is choosing to do it by choice, whereas sex trafficking is involuntary. They are either being forced or coerced to be in that position. Sex workers, the individual is in control of their schedule, they're in control of their situation. They also keep 100% of the money that they earn. They're also able to choose working conditions. They do have the option to stop or leave at any time. And in some cases, the sex workers are still criminalized in certain states, but that's very different than sex trafficking. As we will go into more detail, sex trafficking does involve a third party, usually a pimp who is in control. Also, the individual must give a portion or all of their money to the trafficker. The sex trafficking victim is also forced to work in unsafe conditions. This often involves drugs and alcohol. They're usually not able to leave, or they have to pay a very large amount of money in order to leave their situation. And the pimp or another third party is the one who is charged in sex trafficking cases. So that's an important distinction to make in this presentation. Some of the common misconceptions of sex trafficking include that sex trafficking is only happening in the bigger cities, in the metropolitan areas, and not in rural areas like the reservations. But we do know that sex trafficking is happening in all different places and corners of the country. And also another misconception is that it must involve kidnapping, confinement, or physical force. And this is mainly due to the type of stereotypical sex trafficking that we see like in movies, where someone is being kidnapped, maybe put in the back of a van, they're like blindfolded, and they're taking them across maybe state lines or to another country to traffic them. And while this is the case, there are also other situations and circumstances that sex trafficking victims do find themselves in. Also, traffickers are always strangers to the victim. That's another misconception. We think that these traffickers are scary strangers who we don't really know. But oftentimes, sex trafficking victims are getting trafficked by somebody they know, whether that's a family member, an intimate partner, or maybe someone who started off as a friend and then ended up grooming them and taking advantage of them. Another common misconception is that victims are always female. We do know that this is false as well. There are a lot of female victims in sex trafficking, but males can also be victims as well. Another misconception is that victims are eager to receive help. Sometimes this is the case, but also victims can be scared to seek help because they're living in fear of their trafficker. And sex trafficking also does not always involve the exchange of money. It can also involve the exchange of other goods, such as drugs, different types of items of value. So it's not always money that's being exchanged. So some of the most common types of sex trafficking include escort services. So this can look like having victims in brothels as well as working the public streets. Also looking for people at truck stops or even out of households. There's also illicit massage parlors, the health and beauty industry, and then pornography as well. We do know that some people involved in pornography are being sex trafficked. So who are the traffickers? Usually because of movies and just media in general, we often think of traffickers as these big, scary men who are strangers. Usually the victims probably don't know who their traffickers are, but we do know that this is not the case. There are some pictures on the slides of two individuals who are actually very young women, I think in their 20s, who were running a sex trafficking ring. So it can be pretty much anyone who is trafficking victims. It can be family members who might be trafficking out their young children. They can also be romantic partners, especially new romantic partners. Also new friends, which we see often with child sex trafficking victims. Gangs and cartels can also be involved in sex trafficking. Of course, we do have strangers who might be traffickers as well. There can be traffickers present in your community, people who you might know, also business owners and others. So there's really no limit as to who might be a trafficker. So it's very important, when trying to do prevention work, that you consider all of these different possibilities. So some recruitment tactics that traffickers use in order to lure their victims. You can see in some pictures on the screen, they do use social media a lot. So you can see in that post, they're asking, are you in a job that you don't like? Do you want to make more money? Do you want to make quick money? So they try to target people's vulnerabilities. Maybe they might be in financial stress at the moment, or maybe somebody doesn't want to work a traditional 9 to 5 job. So this might sound appealing to some individuals. And then as you can see on the top of the screen, the wanted sign, it's asking teens for an after-school job. It mentions that you can earn up to $100 per week. You can see that there's no real job description or job title in the posting. It also mentions working evenings and Saturdays, as well as free trips and activities. Transportation is provided, and it's looking for people who are 14 years and older. It's also encouraging individuals to bring their friends as well. So things like this can be very sketchy, and it doesn't really seem legitimate. So these are the types of things that you would really need to steer away from. Traffickers also try to recruit often from rural areas or border towns, because they do know that there might be higher rates of poverty in those areas. Again, they also do use social media, especially when they're targeting the younger population. Sometimes traffickers might promise someone a better life, so maybe they're targeting someone who might be experiencing homelessness or poverty, who's looking for a way out, and they might be in a very vulnerable state, and traffickers do try to prey on that vulnerability. They might also have a marriage proposal and offer to marry whoever they're trying to target. Especially with the younger child sex trafficking victims, oftentimes the traffickers will give them gifts and give them special treatment to make them feel like they're special and that they're cared about. Traffickers also do often provide access to drugs and alcohol to their victims as another way to lure them to work for them. They also groom and will compliment people who they're trying to target, and grooming is just a way of getting someone ready to eventually try to take advantage of them and have them be someone that they're trafficking. You can see that a lot with the younger child victims. Victims are also made to believe that it might be a business proposition, so they might think they're going into a different type of job. Maybe the traffickers are disguising it as like a modeling job or an acting job. So they're trying to lure people who are, just trying to kind of catch a break and maybe try to make their way into the modeling scene or the acting scene. Victims might also believe that it's a quick way to make money and that they can stop whenever they want to. So this is another example of how traffickers are trying to make it look very desirable to work whatever job they're trying to disguise trafficking as. So they'll usually say, you can make money very quickly. It's not a traditional 9 to 5 job, and you can stop whenever you want to. But we do know that once these individuals get involved in sex trafficking, it is very hard for them to leave. So when we look at how sex trafficking came into our Native communities, we do go all the way back to the time before we were colonized. So we know that Native women and girls have been victims of human trafficking for centuries. Before Columbus came over, we as Native people did not have the tradition of being involved in sex trafficking, or we didn't have sex trafficking within our own communities. When Christopher Columbus and his men came over to America, they did participate in selling Taino women and girls for rape. And now we know that this is called sex trafficking. So there's a quote there on the slide that says, 100 castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm, and it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. And this was written in one of Columbus's writings. So we do know that these abuses have been going on for centuries, and they have spread and continued into today as other Spanish and European countries colonized the continent. And this made sex trafficking a central component of the colonization of Central and North America. Okay, we also do see family trafficking happening as well. So almost half of child trafficking cases included some involvement by family members. This is not exclusive to Native families. This is a larger issue within our country. Usually, mothers might traffic their children to their husbands, their boyfriends, to their friends, or other individuals. They often will sell their children to family members or other people in exchange for sex, money, or drugs, especially if they do have a drug addiction. And children sold by their family members for sex are often in a social situation associated with poverty. So some individual factors that might make somebody more vulnerable to being targeted for sex trafficking include age. So definitely minors are more vulnerable and more targeted by traffickers. Also, people who do have financial barriers or are experiencing poverty. Anyone who has drug addictions, alcohol addictions, especially our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit relatives, they are also very vulnerable to being trafficked. Individuals who might have any type of disabilities, people who don't have access to education or jobs wherever that they live. Also homelessness or youth who have ran away from home. Individuals who have history of abuse and violence in their lifetimes. Maybe they grew up in an abusive household or experienced child sexual abuse. And also individuals who have a lack of resources or support systems. So traffickers definitely do try to seek out people who they perceive to be more vulnerable. Some societal factors that also can contribute to the high rates of sex trafficking include a lack of resources in tribal communities. So oftentimes we do see that there aren't that many jobs available on our reservations, which can lead to things like poverty. Also, oil and natural gas on tribal lands, especially man camps that are present up in the northern part of the country, which are basically just really big plots of land where you can see in the picture on the top right hand, they're like really long trailers that the oil field workers will live in, and having that large congregation of non-Indian men living on a reservation can lead to a lot of our women and children either going missing or being physically or sexually assaulted. Also, having an increase in use of technology, especially with our younger generation always being on social media, always being on their phones, it does make them more susceptible to being targeted. Also, the sexual objectification of Indigenous women, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. Also, the community having any type of denial, disbelief, or stigma surrounding sex trafficking. So oftentimes our community members don't think that sex trafficking is happening in our area. Unfortunately, it is, and it's really important to kind of break down that stigma so we can start to talk about the topic more and try to raise awareness about the issue. Also, people who do use social media frequently, especially, again, our younger generation, they are probably a lot easier to target while they are on social media. We do know that a lot of traffickers are using social media and the internet to do most of their recruiting. Also, having a lack of laws that address human trafficking and sex trafficking, especially within our tribal government systems. We don't have a lot of laws in place to combat human trafficking. And then also the jurisdictional issues that do surround crimes that happen on Indigenous reservations. Okay, so like I mentioned, objectification of Indigenous women is a big factor as to why some of our women and our children and our relatives are being trafficked at higher rates. So one of the most detrimental factors contributing to not only sex trafficking, but sexual abuse, domestic violence, and the disappearance and murders of Indigenous women is the objectification of our women. You can see in the pictures on the left that a lot of the depictions of Native women are sexualized, wearing costumes. that are supposed to resemble us as Native women and making them more sexualized. It can be very detrimental to our own Native people, and it results in Indigenous women being no longer seen as people, but they're seen as sexual objects for the pleasure of men instead. So sex trafficking, how does that relate to missing and murdered Indigenous women? We do know that sex trafficking can often go unnoticed in Indigenous communities for various reasons. There's also limited data for both MMIW and trafficking cases, so it's not clear as to how many of the MMIW cases are due to sex trafficking. There are high amounts of domestic and sexual violence that go unreported and are not being investigated, especially with child sexual abuse as well. We do know that there's a lot more cases than what are being reported. Some Indigenous women and girls are going missing for the purposes of sex trafficking. Like I said, we don't know how many of those cases are due to sex trafficking, but we do know that it is a large issue. Some trafficking cases are often misclassified as either prostitution or sexual abuse. So if victims do eventually end up leaving the trafficking situation, sometimes they are charged with prostitution instead, or the authorities might think that it was just sexual abuse going on and not actual trafficking. And non-native traffickers on tribal lands often equals no justice for the victims. So here on Navajo Nation, they do have a law against human trafficking, which was signed in 2017. This was sponsored by Council Delegates Nathaniel Brown and Amber Crotty. The intent was to deter human traffickers by criminalizing certain offenses, prescribing appropriate punishment, giving priority to the investigation and prosecution of trafficking offenses, and protecting and providing justice to victims. This grants the Navajo Nation the ability to charge non-Navajo traffickers. It does have a maximum sentence of a prison term of 1 year and or a fine of up to $5,000. It influenced the beginning of tribal staff in various departments being trained to recognize signs of human trafficking. So this looks like, people who work in casinos being trained on how to identify human trafficking, as well as training law enforcement personnel as well. And it fosters the need for more data collection, prevention efforts, and case investigations on the Navajo Nation. So it is a very good step in the right direction. All right, where is trafficking happening? So sex trafficking can really happen anywhere. Like we talked about a little bit earlier, it can happen out of homes. It can also happen at public places such as bus stations, hotels, truck stops. These are areas where a lot of different people are often coming and going. It can also happen at casinos, powwows, where there's a lot of people in one small area. It can also happen on the internet through social media. Traffickers might find victims in bars or strip clubs. It can also be happening out on the streets, in massage parlors, escort services, shopping malls, within shelters, and also at schools such as tribal community colleges or larger universities. So some red flags to look out for when trying to identify an individual who might be being trafficked. So there are a few different behavioral indicators. The first one is the individual is fearful while speaking to others. They might be avoiding answering questions, or they let other people speak for them. They aren't really able to make eye contact with other people who are speaking to them. They might also lie about their age and their identity. So maybe there's someone who looks like they're a lot younger who is lying about their age to make them seem like they're older, or maybe they're using a different name, which isn't their name that they usually go by. Also, they might seem coached in talking to law enforcement and other authority figures. And they might also have a financial dependency as well. Some physical indicators of a victim who might be in sex trafficking. They might have multiple electronic devices, so maybe they'll have 2 different cell phones, maybe one cell phone they use for personal stuff, and then they have another one just for the trafficking. They might also have large amounts of cash, which might be unusual for them otherwise. If they look like they're physically malnourished, if they have any tattoos, burns, or brands that you haven't seen before, or maybe it's something that is out of the ordinary for them. Also, if they have any signs of sexual abuse, physical assault, or torture, that can look like broken bones, burns, or even concussions, and if they have any signs of having some type of substance abuse. So red flags in adolescence. So this is really important to know if you're ever working with children or even just with your own younger family members at home. Some behavioral indicators are significant change in behavior in the child. Also, if the child is cutting ties with their usual friends, maybe they start hanging out with a whole different group of people at school. If they mention that they're in a relationship with an older friend, this friend might be someone who is a lot older than them and maybe might have met them through social media. That's also another large red flag. Again, if the child is lying about their age or their identity to make them seem more older. If they seem like they're coached and talking to law enforcement, or if they're preoccupied with getting money, or they're constantly talking about amount of interest in buying things or just making money in general, that's also another red flag. Some physical indicators would be evidence that the child has been or will be traveling. So if they're living out of a hotel or living out of a car, maybe they have suitcases with them all the time. If they don't seem like they have a very stable home environment. Also, if they have clothing or jewelry that they have no income to pay for. So again, if it's something out of the usual, maybe they are usually wearing regular age-appropriate clothes, and then they start to show up to school wearing more provocative clothing. Maybe they have expensive jewelry on. That would also be another red flag. If their school performance or their attendance starts to drop very rapidly, and if they're always accompanied by someone who monitors what they say or what they do. Okay, so looking at some signs of potential online recruitment for trafficking, we do know that it's happening very frequently. It can happen through social media, online ads, or even on online dating sites. So one thing to be very wary of is instant love. So, normally when you're meeting someone, it does take time to get to know them. It takes time to share information between you and the other person. So if you are doing any type of online dating, it's important to kind of limit the personal information that you share through the internet. Also, if the other person has a willingness to pay, maybe the individual who you're talking to online might want you to fly somewhere to go see them. Maybe they're willing to pay for everything. It may seem flattering, but it's kind of not the normal way of online dating. So that could be a red flag. So if you do decide to meet with someone from online, make sure that it's somewhere you feel safe and comfortable, and make sure you let one of your friends or family members know where you're going, what time you're going to be there, who you're meeting up with. That way someone else knows where you're at all times. Also, if you see job promises being offered, if it sounds too good to be true, keep in mind it probably is too good to be true. Be wary of job offers in fields like modeling or acting, and in remote locations that are far away from where you live. So if you do see some of these signs, just pay special attention to the individual who you're talking to, and the most important thing is to stay safe if you do decide to meet up with somebody from the internet. Okay, so potential recruitment in public places. We do know that traffickers recruit in a variety of places in public as well, not just online. So these places can be on college campuses as well as at nightclubs, bars, and malls. If you are at a bar, make sure you keep an eye on your drink. Traffickers will often look for an opportunity to impair your judgment by using different types of drugs. So if you do lose track of your drink, make sure to dump it out and get a new one. Also, again, be wary of instant love. Traffickers ask probing questions to find out if you are alone, if you have a loving family, and would be willing to potentially hook up with them. So this is kind of the trafficker's way of trying to fill out whether or not they think that you would be a good person to target for their sex trafficking. Also, whenever you go out into public, always have a safety plan. Follow your instincts and tell friends or family members where you're going and when you expect to return back, especially if you plan on going somewhere by yourself. Okay, so now that we've covered, how much of an issue sex trafficking is, not just on the reservations, but also in our country as a whole, it's important to talk about what we can do on an individual level in order to prevent trafficking. So first and most important would be to practice ke. We as Navajo people, we are often told to always look out for one another, to look out for our family and our friends and all of our relatives in the community. So if you start to notice signs in maybe one of your close family members or friends, try to reach out to them and ask the individual if they are okay. Maybe offer them some support. If they do, feel like they're in an unsafe situation, you can always give them resources to try to help them. And report any suspicious behavior, especially when there are children involved. We can also create loving and supportive environments for our young ones to make sure that we're preventing some of these other factors, such as youth runaways, people who are experiencing homelessness, substance abuse, and other issues. And on a community and policy level, we can advocate to create environments, opportunities, and services that help lower the presence of certain risk factors. Again, these risk factors can be things such as poverty, substance misuse, sexual and domestic violence, child abuse, access to school and employment opportunities, as well as homelessness and runaway youth. We can also train law enforcement and other public sectors about the warning signs of sex trafficking. So that is the end of my presentation. There are some resources on the screen if you think that you might be being trafficked or you know someone who might be in that situation. So there is a National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can call, text, or chat with them online. There's also the New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions that does have a human trafficking hotline. There's also the cyber tip line for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children if you do think that there is a child who is being trafficked. Thank you.